Good morning again, Inspector. Just to say you are live on YouTube.
All right, good morning. Just see whether you can hear me.
Yeah, everything is fine.
And anything that anyone wants to raise before I hand over to Mr. Howell Williams? No, in that case, Mr. Howell Williams and Mr. Ross, if you'd like to respond to Mr. Howell Williams. Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Howell Williams, you're on mute.
Good morning, Mr. Ross.
Good morning, Mr. Howell Williams.
Morning. Now, my questions are set in the context of the inspector having heard a considerable amount of evidence, and of course, you and I recognizing that a lot of what you say relies on the evidence of others.
Absolutely.
And as you indicate in your proof of evidence, you've focused on reason for refusal 1 and AB 70.
That is correct.
And I'm going to focus on those two matters. That's not to say that the inspector should disregard your weighing of the balance at all, but it seems to me that squabbling over the use of particular terms is not necessarily going to help, especially when we're not using the same terms. And of course, those matters can be covered, I hope, adequately in our closing submissions. I should also point out that I'm not going to ask you about comments you make in your evidence, the written evidence, about the council's approach to the last scheme and this scheme, and it's mainly for the reason given by Mr. White, but it's also, I think, because of course this inspector will be starting really with a clean sheet and addressing the merits of this scheme on its own, won't it?
Yes, no, I agree with that, Mr. Howell Williams.
Okay, having heard your evidence in chief, Mr. Ross, another reason why I'm hoping that we won't take up too much inquiry time is because actually there's a great deal of common ground in terms not only of what's agreed and disagreed, but actually in terms of approach. In terms of the basic approach, the overall approach, you rightly have said that the governing approach is under section 38, subsection 6 of the 2004 Act.
That is correct, Mr. Howell Williams.
And you and I know, and it's reflected, indeed it's referred to in the framework, that decisions should be made in accordance with the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. It's in effect, it's a presumption, isn't it, in favour of the statutory development plan?
Yes, that is correct.
And therefore it's essential for the inspector to consider the policies and their wording, interpret them correctly and apply them to determine whether there's overall accordance, and then to turn to any other material considerations.
That's absolutely correct, Mr. Howell Williams.
And in this case, there are a range of material considerations, you might say, but first, of course, there is the framework itself, and that contains a raft of policies, doesn't it? And there are also other issues such as housing land supply and indeed other factors which have their own self-sufficient status.
Yes, the inspector should be considering everything that's material. If the inspector does not take into account a material consideration, that may mean the decision is not correct.
I think you're right. It will mean that. And of course, whilst the interpretation of policy is ultimately a question of law, it's another reason why I don't want to spend too long on it. The application of the policy is a matter of judgment for the policy or the decision maker.
That is absolutely correct. Yes, yes, Mr. Howell-Williams.
Yeah, and the question of weight in particular is not governed by law. The law makes it quite clear that weight is entirely a matter for the decision maker.
It's a matter of planning judgment. Yes, Mr. Howell-Williams.
Thank you. And the framework, of course, is not law. It is a material consideration and an important one.
I'd agree with that.
Importantly, it doesn't change the status of the development plan. You'd agree with that as well.
Absolutely. Yes.
Thank you. And in a way, that range of agreed propositions, which are, if I may say so, indisputable, is reflected in your approach, because your primary case is that your scheme accords with the development plan. I appreciate you've got the fallback argument about the tilted balance, but your primary case is to say we accord with the statutory development plan, and there are no material considerations which indicate that permission shouldn't be granted.
That is my approach. That is correct.
Thank you. Could you look to page 25 of your proof of evidence? And I just would like to ask you some questions about weight here in the context of our agreement just now, just so that you can help us with the submissions that we will be making to the inspector. You say here that matters of weight, you say, can be found in two places. That's at paragraph 7.3. Do you see that?
Yes, that is correct.
And you say the first is paragraph 11, where the most important policies are considered to be out of date if there's no 5-year housing land supply. This is the case here. And the second is in the framework at paragraph 219.
That's what I say.
So far, you might have paragraph 11 in front of you.
I will in a second. I do, yes, thank you very much.
And there's no dispute that the inspector needs to look at this paragraph. And indeed, there's no dispute about the triggering of the tilted balance. The planning authority has indicated that it is content for the decision to be made on that basis. But so far as weight is concerned, we have little d there. Do you see that?
Yes.
Yeah. And the mechanism for the tilted balance there, the trigger as it were, and then Roman 2 adverse impacts of doing so, and then there's the tilted balance by reference to the policies in the framework taken as a whole and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Paragraph 11d does not address weight, does it?
Well, it sets out that policies, the most important policies, will be out of date. And therefore, if a policy is out of date, you have to consider what weight is afforded to it.
Exactly. So when I say exactly, what I'm putting to you is it doesn't address the question of weight, does it?
Weight sets out the policies will be out of date.
No, just answer my question. It doesn't address the question of weight, does it? That's for 219.
No, 219 addresses policies that could be out of the weight afforded to policies, even if they're up to date.
But paragraph 219 addresses weight in express terms.
Paragraph 2, yes.
This paragraph does not do that.
It sets out the policies will be out of date.
And the answer to my question is what?
Well, if a policy is out of date, you have to consider what weight to be afforded to it.
So is it I just need to know from my submission,
Yes,
that your approach is that paragraph 11D does address weight?
yes.
And is weight referred to anywhere there?
Well, it says that policies will be out of date.
But even if it says that, which it obviously says the most important policies are out of date, it doesn't address weight by reference to even out of date policies.
Well, if you've got an out of date policy, you have to consider what weight to be afforded to it.
Yeah, but it doesn't help you with addressing that question, does it?
I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're asking, Mr. Howell-Williams.
Put it this way: treating this paragraph treats policies as out of date for the purposes of triggering the tilted balance, doesn't it?
It does two things.
No, does it do that first?
If the most important policies are out of date, the tilted balance is triggered.
Yeah, so the answer to my question is yes, Mr. Howell-Williams, it does do that. It is a mechanism, isn't it, for triggering the tilted balance?
It is a mechanism for triggering the tilted balance.
And in that mechanism, whilst it refers to the most important policies being out of date, it doesn't assist with the question of weight because it is a policy tool for engaging the tilted balance.
No, Mr. Howell-Williams, I disagree with that. I think it does two things. I think it triggers the tilted balance and also makes you look at what weight to be afforded to the out-of-date policies.
I'll leave that with the inspector. But applying the tilted balance in Roman 2, is it your approach that the question of weight is addressed in that tilted balance to be given to policies?
11D2.
Yeah.
Well, that's a planning balance.
Yes.
That is the tilted balance.
Yes. And does it address the weight to be given to policies?
Well, when you're carrying out the tilted balance, you'd need to know what weight to be afforded to matters, wouldn't you?
Exactly. So what's the answer to my question? This tilted balance in this policy, which sets out the balance to be struck, it doesn't address the question of weight to be given to policies, does it?
It requires, no, Mr. Howell-Williams. My reading of the policy is that you are required to look at the weight to be afforded to policies.
Thank you. And the weight to be attached to policies is addressed in paragraph 219, isn't it?
Well, can we go to paragraph 219, please, sir?
Oh, yeah.
So 219, and it obviously has to be read in the context of 218. Policies in this framework are material considerations which should be taken into account when dealing with applications down publication. And then it says, however, existing policies should not be considered out of date simply because they were adopted or made prior to the publication of the framework, and due weight should be given to them. That relates to existing policies that may be in conflict with the NPPF. It doesn't relate to policies that are out of date due to the application of paragraph 11D. That's why I say there are two ways where policies could be out of date. One, conflict with the NPPF, and when it says existing policies should not be considered simply because they were adopted or made publication. And then you've got a different way of policies being out of date and consideration of weight coming out of paragraph 11D. They're different policies, Mr. Howell-Williams, different approaches.
That's what I'm asking you about. And the question I put to you was paragraph 219, to borrow from case law, is the acid test, isn't it, for the question of weight to be given to policies? It's
only the acid test when you're considering policies against the NPPF. It is not the acid test when you're considering policies that are out of date due to, for example, not having a 5-year housing land supply, because that's not what 219 says.
Right, well, that's a matter for legal submissions thereafter. Can you just confirm this for me? Your table, by all means refer to it, all other policies you're giving full weight to, which is fine.
Yes.
And where you give full weight, for example, in relation to HOU 5, do you see that?
Yes.
And then TRA 5, EN 5, you do make reference to consistency with the framework. Do you see that?
Yes, I do, yes.
And in relation to SP2, perhaps consistent with your last answer, is that you conclude it should have less than full weight because of in short, the housing land shortfall. Yes,
the failure of SP2. Yes, that's correct.
So nowhere do you assert that SP2 should carry reduced weight otherwise than by reference to the housing land shortfall. Either here or anywhere in your proof.
Well, yes, I think that's right, Mr. Howell-Williams.
Yeah, and nowhere do you assert that SP2 is out of date except by reference to the operation of the first part of paragraph 11D and footnote 8. In other words, the housing land shortfall.
Yes, I think that's correct, Mr. Howell-Williams.
And nowhere in your proof do you assert that policy SP2 is inconsistent in terms of paragraph 219 and consistency with the framework as a whole.
I accept that SP2 in general terms is consistent with the NPPF in terms of what it is trying to do. Whether it's successful or not, that is a separate question, and that's why I've reduced it the way.
That's very helpful, that last answer, thank you. And it is, of course, entirely possible that an authority doesn't have a housing land supply, 5-year housing land supply, but where its policies are still up to date and consistent with the framework taken as a whole.
I think it is possible, but probably not probable, because every local authority would have a policy relating to housing distribution and delivery of housing. And if you don't have a 5-year housing land supply, that policy is clearly failing. But there might be a local plan that doesn't have a housing distribution or a housing policy, and therefore its entire local plan may be up to date.
And you, in your evidence in chief, in explanation of your position, said that it would be, and this was your sole point, you said, well, in the context of boosting housing delivery, you said if you were to continue to give full weight, that would be quite wrong because the failure will continue. Do you remember that?
That is correct. Yes, I did say that, Mr. Howell-Williams.
Yeah. But in terms of the approach, there's a flaw there, isn't there? Because that would sort of indicate that in some way housing land supply and the shortage is left out of account in the section 38.6 balance.
No, I don't get you, Mr. Howell Williams, in relation to your assertion.
All right. So it's not necessarily the case that the failure to which you refer would continue by giving full weight to a policy, okay? If the policy is workable. You with me?
Yes, no, I am with you. I am with you.
Yeah, it doesn't follow, therefore, that you shouldn't give full weight, because the policy could be given full weight rationally, properly, because it's still workable. It doesn't follow from that that the failure will continue, because the shortage of housing, land, could be taken into account as a material consideration.
No, I think this is where we're going to disagree, and I'm sure you'll make submissions on it. There must be two elements to it, because how can you continue giving full weight to a policy where you don't have a 5-year housing land supply? Which is the housing distribution policy, for example, in this case. Something must be going wrong in order for you to get to that position. And
I've got that point. I'm only really talking, sorry to interrupt, Mr. Ross, but
no, that's okay.
I'm only trying to provide clarity of our position, not only to make submissions, but to help the inspector. I don't want to talk about the failure per se, okay? I'm talking about the question of weight. And when talking about weight, you say, well, it's quite wrong to give weight to a policy where there's a housing land supply shortage, because the failure will continue.
I didn't say that, Mr. Howell Williams.
I thought you did. So
no, I didn't. I didn't say you're quite wrong to give no weight to a policy. That isn't what I said.
Full weight, less than full weight. Okay.
Okay. Yes. Well, I think it is wrong, because that is the policy that's supposed to continue to be able for the council to be able to demonstrate they've got a 5-year housing land supply and meeting the housing land supply overall.
I've got that, but
yes,
the inspector has to ask himself whether the policy is working. Okay, and your case is, well, we can come within the policy. Okay, so in part, you're halfway towards me anyway, Mr. Ross. Just forgive me. What you say is it's quite wrong to give full weight, because if you were to do that, the failure to provide enough for the 5-year housing land supply is going to continue. But that's not correct, because the policy might be perfectly workable. Okay. And in any event, the housing land supply shortage could be taken into account in the balance as a material consideration. Indeed, it should be taken into account. It doesn't affect necessarily the weight to be given to the policy.
I don't agree with you, Mr. Howell Williams. I see your point, but I don't agree with you.
Okay, well, we'll leave that, Mr. Ross. Thanks very much. Could you turn to the local plan?
Bear with me a second, Mr. Howell Williams. I'll bring it up. Yes, please.
I think that's all I'm looking at. And turn, if you would, to
sorry, can I just interrupt? I've had a message to say that there was lost power in the civic centre, so my programme officer missed some of it, but it looks as though everyone else has been able to stay in touch. So I'm hoping it doesn't prejudice anyone by having that loss of power. So it seems as though that my programme officer has been able to rejoin. So hello, Ms. Williams, if you'd like to clarify that, please. You
Sorry, sir. Yes, we lost it for about 2 minutes here, but I came straight back on and the session continued. So I would imagine that the live stream would still have continued on YouTube.
Yeah.
So everything should be continuity.
Right. Okay, then that's fine. I just wanted to check what the problem was, but thank you. Thank you, Mr. Williams. Right. Sorry about that. I'll hand back to Mr. Howell Williams.
Good,
You were going to move on to something else anyway, I think.
Yes,
Yeah.
the local plan. And Mr. Ross, I just want to ask you, hopefully, a really quick question on page 3. Okay. And this is a reference to the corporate plan 2015.
Yes, I'm with you, Mr. Howell Williams. Thank you.
And Mr. White asked Mrs. Goodyear questions about this. It's not referred to anywhere in your proof of evidence, and I'd rather assume from that that you didn't think it was relevant. Would I be correct?
No, it's obviously part of the key evidence for the local plan, and obviously I've read it.
Sure.
But you are correct in terms of my assessment concentrates more on the policies of the local plan.
Yeah, but in any event, not of such relevance that you thought it worthwhile even to refer to in your proof.
That is correct, Mr. Howell Williams.
Yeah, sure. And plainly, this is a document which sets out the vision up to 2020.
Yes, that is what it says. Yes.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm not going to waste any more time on that, Mr. Ross. Thank you. So turn to the up-to-date planning vision on page 8. And certainly, Mr. Ross will try not just to, repeat what we've already told the inspector, having regard to his advice at the beginning of the inquiry. But we can agree, can't we, that the main focus is on Ashford for development.
That is correct. Yes, that's what it says.
And this passage indicates why, well, a number of reasons why it's important that the main focus should be on Ashford.
Yes, I think it does, yes.
And you and I can agree that the approach of the vision in the rural areas is very different.
The rural areas are not the main focus for development.
The approach to rural areas is very different, isn't it?
It is different, yes.
No, sorry. Very different.
The rural areas are not restricted from having development, and therefore it is a different approach.
Yeah. And the answer to my question is, you disagree?
No, it is no, Mr. Howell Williams, the approach is different.
So you disagree that it's very different?
Yes, that is correct.
And it's right, isn't it, that Tenterden, even as the second most sustainable settlement, as you rightly point out, is not recorded as having the same or even similar attributes or problems as Ashford.
Sorry, I missed the word after attributes.
It's not, Tenterden is not said to have the same or even similar attributes or problems.
Can you clarify, Mr. Howell Williams, what you mean by problems?
Regeneration, for example.
So regeneration is a problem, according to you?
I'm looking at the vision and the rationale which you said is given to one of the reasons for the main focus on Ashford.
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't say the regeneration is a problem, though, but I accept your proposition. I just, I don't think that regeneration would be a problem.
You accept the proposition anyway?
Yes.
And whilst there is reference to Tenterden having a strong offer of shops and services, you'd agree that there's no reference to a wide range of employment.
Not in there, but no, not in that paragraph.
Sure. And Mr. White asked Mrs. Goodyear about the third line of the third paragraph. Do you remember? Conserving and enhancing a historic centre and accommodating development of a suitable scale. Do you remember?
Yes.
What he didn't do, presumably to save time, was refer to the rest of that sentence, design and character, which is part of the rationale. You'd agree, isn't it?
It is, yes.
And the last sentence of that paragraph referring to the natural assets in all rural settlements, including Tenterden.
Yes, that is correct, yes.
Yeah. And indeed, the next paragraph about protecting the identity and attractive character of the rural area.
Yes, no, absolutely. That's yeah. No.
Anyway, so, but you only think, well, the approach to rural areas there is different, but not very different. That's how.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
Well, I think you know, when you look at Ashford, that, you know, they also talk about conservation and character areas and enhancement. The approach is not significantly different. I think the significant is or kind of the area of difference is, in terms of Ashford, it's a main focus. The other areas don't have that main focus.
Sure. Well, this may explain your stress on the word majority in SP2, that you don't regard the rationale for the distribution as being making a very significant distinction between Ashford and the rural areas. So that's what I'm trying to help the inspector with. And part of that, we can agree for the inspector, is part of it because you don't think, well, the rationale is not really very different.
Well, I've said it's different.
Yeah, but you said it's not very different, so that's fine.
Yeah.
So if we look to the strategic objectives, and I think there's common ground as to which are the most relevant, I think, but it would be quite wrong of the inspector to consider the strategic objectives in some sort of vacuum. They should be considered with the vision for their proper interpretation, shouldn't they?
Well, the strategic objectives are the policy. So that's what the inspector should be concentrating on. The vision is not policy, is it? I mean, it's important. I'm not saying that the vision is not important, but for the purpose of the policies of the development plan, it's compliance with SP1, not compliance totally with the vision, which isn't part of the policy.
So what's the answer to my question, that the inspector should understand, interpret and apply those principles in the context of the vision from which they flow?
Yes, Mr. Howell-Williams.
Yes. Okay, and with that in mind, could you look to what the inspector said about that at CD 2.2? And if
bear with me, Mr. Howell-Williams. This document, sorry, this document is the one that takes a long time to open for me for some reason.
Just tell me when you got there.
Sorry for this. It's getting there. I have it now, Mr. Howell-Williams. Where would you like to go?
Okay, there are, just for the inspector's note, there are 3 paragraphs to refer to: 15, 20 and 29.
Mm-hmm.
And if we just look at 15, just to note that there was criticism that insufficient consideration has been given to the role the rural area could play. Okay. And there's reference to the sustainability appraisal and no failings in it. Then paragraph 20, the sustainability appraisal has sufficiently evaluated the reasonable alternatives and is found to be comprehensive, satisfactory and legally compliant. And paragraph 29 also I want just to flag up for the inspector, because this is issue 1, are the vision and strategic objectives for Ashford Sound having regard to achieving sustainable development. And it's quite clear not only that the local plan inspectors expressly endorsed the vision and the strategic objectives, but considered them one and together.
Yes, I've got no doubt that that's what the local plan inspector did.
Thank you. SP2 then, please.
Yes, I have that. Thank you.
Thanks. And you and I would agree this is a relevant and important policy.
Yes, we agree.
And it reflects the vision and objectives, the strategic approach to which we've just referred.
I believe it does, yes.
And it seeks, doesn't it, in particular, by reference to its distribution, reflect what you and I have just discussed as being, well, in your view, different approaches, and in the council's view, very different approaches.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There is, you know, what the policy says is what the policy says.
No, well, I didn't ask you that. I mean, that's obviously axiomatic. But what I asked you was whether it reflects the vision and the strategic objectives, and in its distribution, the different or very different approaches to Ashford and the rural area.
I'd accept that, yes.
Thank you. And if we looked to 2.64, and you see there's a series of paragraphs dealing with the borough's profile. Do you have that?
Yes, I do, yes.
And at 2.64, Ashford is clearly the most sustainable location within the borough, and therefore the most suitable location at which to deliver the majority of new housing growth. And that's a proposition that you wouldn't disagree with.
No, I accept that, yes.
In comparison, the borough's rural area is much more sensitive, and too much housing growth would quickly lead to an unsustainable model of housing development overall. So that's the rural areas approach, reflecting what we say is a very different approach.
Mm-hmm.
So
well, that's
different, but not very different.
Yes, that's what it says.
Yes. And then it says in the next paragraph, these characteristics are clearly evidenced in the sustainability appraisal and reflected in the plan's distribution strategy, which identifies new housing land allocations, and then those two figures which we see in SP2.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then in the next paragraph, any significant divergence with this broad approach, in other words, transferring major housing growth from Ashford to the rural parts of the borough, should be avoided. Doing so would result in an unsustainable model of development by, and then there's a number of things set out there. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do, yes.
And this is the downside, isn't it? Part of the council's case for altering or changing the focus in SP2, because it would, for example, take away and focus development elsewhere where it wouldn't meet the objectives of the vision and undermine the distribution by reference to those factors.
I can understand that that's what the council approach is, but as you can see, what it says is any significant divergence from this broad approach, transferring major housing growth from Ashford to the rural parts. And I would argue that, first thing, I would argue that 141 homes is not a significant divergence. And second, I would question whether delivery of 141 homes in Tenterden is transferring housing growth from Ashford to the rural area of the borough.
Sure. Okay. That's what I thought you'd say. And plainly, it's a matter for the inspector to determine the question. And he should do so and take into account the bullet points set out in 2.66, shouldn't he? And measure the question of significance against those factors.
Well, I'm not sure that I agree exactly with that, Mr. Howell-Williams, because what the bullet points are the result of doing it. If you don't do it, if the inspector comes to the viewpoint, which is wholly he can, that there's no significant divergence, or the granting this consent does not transfer major housing growth from Ashford to rural areas, you don't go to those bullet points, do you?
Okay, I hear what you say. It must be right, mustn't it, having regard to this paragraph, that the inspector should consider whether the appeal proposal would contribute to the unsustainable outcomes referred to in this paragraph. Can you agree with that, Eve?
Well, I struggle to agree with that, because Tenterden is not an unsustainable location. I accept that Ashford is more sustainable, but what your proposition would mean is that all additional development would have to be in Ashford. And clearly that I'm sure that's not the council's case. It accepts that there can be development elsewhere. It's not a all development should be taking place in Ashford. That was one of the proposals that the sustainability appraisal considered and was rejected by the local authority and the local plan inspector as not being able to deliver. So you know, there is development both in the rural areas and in Ashford, and I don't think you could say that having development outside of Ashford would inevitably be unsustainable.
Yeah, well, just, I don't mean to interrupt, Mr. Ross, but I didn't put anything like that to you, okay? What I asked you was whether the inspector on this case should ask himself, we've agreed this paragraph is relevant, and you said yes, but it doesn't trouble the appeal proposal because this development is not significant. And then I said to you, but that would mean that the inspector should at least consider the appeal proposal and whether or not it contributes to the unsustainability outcomes set out in this paragraph. And you said, well, I'd struggle with that, and then went on to answer a question I didn't ask you.
That is fair enough. No, I don't agree with you, Mr. Howell-Williams. I think that if the inspector comes to a view that it isn't a significant divergence, and I can't see how 141 dwellings are, and that this is transferring major growth, that's where he ends. Because that is.
Okay, so sorry.
No, you go, Mr. Howell-Williams, please.
I've just made a note that you don't agree that the inspector should consider whether or not the appeal proposals contributes to the unsustainability outcomes in this paragraph.
That is correct.
Thank you. so far as significance are concerned, and whether or not, as we would put it, this development contributes to those unsustainable outcomes, your case, I think, is reflected in well, of course it's reflected in your proof of evidence of paragraph 8.16. Okay, you're going to have that to hand. And I just want to ask you about that, because we want to try and help the inspector, don't we? And they don't need to keep on saying, it won't have that effect or anything, but just let's look at what the inspector can take into account. And you made the point in your evidence in chief on a number of occasions, is that you say, well, look at the wording of the policy, SP2, remember? And you say, it says the majority, okay?
Yes.
And do you interpret this policy? I just want to have a clear note. Again, it's about your interpretation and how you've approached these policies. Is it your approach that this policy, taken as a whole and in context, requires only a bare majority of development in Ashford?
I think that when you're looking at the policy and looking at the overall distribution of the 13,118 homes in the context of the second paragraph, so long as Ashford has the majority of housing, that policy is complied with.
So I'll put the question again. I think your last answer did do the question justice, but I'm just going to see whether you can answer it in the terms that I've put it. I think the answer is yes. Do you interpret the policy, taken as a whole and in context, to require only a bare majority of development in Ashford?
Yes, that is correct. That's what the policy says, but that is not in terms of individual developments. It's when because this is the strategic approach. So overall, when you're looking at the entire housing requirement and the way it will be met through the committed schemes, site allocations and windfalls, you comply with the policy if the majority is in Ashford.
But there's a real difficulty with that, isn't there? Because whilst you're right, the word majority is used, yeah? Looking at it fairly, reasonably, rationally, we would say, it's impossible to interpret this policy as requiring only a bare majority of development in Ashford, not least because of what it proposes by reference to the distribution itself, where, as you rightly point out, nearly 80% of development is intended for Ashford. With
respect, Mr. Howe-Williams, I didn't write the policy. That's what it says.
No, look at the policy. The policy does not just say there should be a majority of development in Ashford. Reflecting the vision, what it says is the majority of housing will be at Ashford and its periphery. With this in mind, bearing in mind all the transport and all the rest of it that we don't need to repeat, in addition to existing commitments, new allocations, there's going to be 4872 dwellings there, as opposed to the very different rural areas where there's going to be, including commitments and land allocations, 1017 dwellings. And you've made the point, referring to the planning state table, I think it's 76% in Ashford. That's nothing like a bare majority. It's the vast majority is expected to be in Ashford. You'd agree with that, wouldn't you?
I'd agree that the majority of housing is proposed to be in Ashford.
No, Mr. Ross. I didn't ask you that question. I asked you, you'd agree that by reference to the figures of nearly 80%, the vast majority, this distribution is for the vast majority of development to be in Ashford, isn't it?
The distribution is for the vast majority of housing to be in Ashford, but that is not what the policy says.
So
If the policy wanted to be the vast majority, that would have been written by the local authority planners.
So I've got a clear note that when you interpret the policy, all it requires is a bare majority, irrespective of the distribution which is set out within the policy.
That's what the policy requires.
Yeah, but that's the way I put it is right, that irrespective of the distribution which is contained within the policy, only a bare majority is required.
The distribution relates to the allocation of houses.
And the commitments and everything that follows. This is the distribution policy. It doesn't set out a bare majority, does it?
It does.
No, it doesn't. Look at it.
It does.
It's nearly 80% is the main focus in Ashford.
No, that's the allocations.
No, it's the commitments as well. It's the distribution strategy which is set out in the policy.
Where does it say that?
Well, I'm looking at it. With this in mind, in other words, this is explaining the majority.
Mm-hmm.
With this in mind, in addition to existing commitments, new now allocation to deliver 4872 dwellings are proposed.
Yeah.
This is the strategic approach to housing delivery in total.
It says that there will be new allocations to deliver 4872.
It doesn't just say that, Mr. Ross. It explains what's meant by the majority.
Yes, which is more than 50%.
And it's much more. It's nearly 80%. There's nothing like a bare majority.
I didn't write the policy. The policy is what.
That.
I mean, we're not.
Just to agree. This distribution reflects a vast majority of development for Ashford. That's what the policy says, isn't it?
No, it doesn't. I'm sorry, Mr. Howe-Williams, it doesn't. The word vast does not exist. The wording is very clear. The majority of new housing is B. That is the wording. It's not a matter of interpretation or anything. That is exactly what the policy says.
And so you don't, that's why you say, well, we're only adding 1%, and therefore there's still a bare majority and it doesn't matter.
Well, even if I agreed with you, Mr. Howe-Williams, which I don't, you still would have, with the grant of consent on this site, the vast majority of housing still in Ashford, wouldn't you?
So it is important, therefore, to look at the scale of the development, isn't it?
Yes, I agree that it is important to look at the scale of development.
Yeah. Okay. And we can look, for example, at the allocations, and Mrs. Goodyear has provided a list of these at her appendix 4. Sorry, appendix 4.
Yeah, no, I'm just getting the document. This one I do have in hard copy.
And so what we're trying to help the inspector with is the question of significance and scale. Okay, rather than a simple mathematical exercise, which is probably pretty limited help to the inspector, is to look at actually what the local plan had in scale terms, what it had in mind. And we see, looking down here, the rural housing allocation. There are 23 sites here listed, I think.
Not going to disagree with you.
No, okay, the Tenterden is the top one, and then you can look down. But what we see there, in terms of what SP2 and the local plan provide for, in terms of the distribution, is that of the 23 sites, 20 are 50 units or under. Would you accept that?
I'm not going to disagree with you, Mr. Howe-Williams.
Yeah. I wish I could say that for all the answers you've given.
Well, would it be much of would it be very entertaining for the rest of the people watching, would it?
And of those 20, the majority are under 20 units.
If you say so, Mr. Howe-Williams.
Right, well, let's keep that up, Mr. Ross. Yes. And that's a clear indication, isn't it, of what the plan envisaged in terms of the acceptable scale in the rural areas?
Well, these are the proposed allocations in the rural areas. That I accept. And as you can see, in Tenterden, the allocation was for 225 homes.
Yeah, but the point I'm making is that that is exception to the rule in terms of the overall general approach to development in the rural areas, which is limited to much smaller schemes of under 50 and so many under even 20. I must admit, I don't know all these settlements, but I'm assuming that they are potentially quite small in scale. I mean, at Charing, Sure.
it was looking at 180 units. That may be a larger and more sustainable settlement, and therefore larger allocations of that scale were appropriate in that location. I think it's location wise rather than considering the overall scale and numbers.
Okay, well, if we look to the local plan itself and we look to Appendix 5.
Bear with me, Mr. Howell Williams, I will be with you.
Or it's on page 334. Tell me when you've got there, Mr. Ross.
Is this is that housing trajectory 2018-2030?
Yes, it is, yeah.
Oh, great. Sorry, I need to, on the PDF, it appears the other way round. So I'll have to see if I can.
Hard copy.
Yes, but the hard copies is much easier to turn around. I need technology to be able to turn it around, but I've got it around now. Thank you.
Okay, so we're just trying to provide some help to the inspector. We can see from this that the local plan envisaged mainly larger scale developments for the Ashford area. Again, reflecting what we say is a very different approach to development.
Yes, I accept that mainly the larger scale developments are proposed in Ashford and the periphery, but it's clearly not all of them. And there are large scale developments also proposed in the rural area, but I wholly accept that they're mainly in Ashford and its periphery.
And of course, you rightly say, well, we should look at Tenterden because it's the second largest settlement. That's correct. That's what your case is, isn't it?
Well, I think that's an agreed position between ourselves and the council.
Well, agreed that we should look to it, yeah. And the local plan again provides some guidance to the sort of scale of development that's acceptable in terms of in the context of SP2 in the supporting text, doesn't it? On page 16.
Page 16. Yes, I have that.
Okay, and we see from paragraph 2.49 there's reference to it being the second largest settlement, playing a main rural service centre role for much of the southwestern part of the borough, attractive historic town with relatively well served by shops and services, being an important tourist destination. And then we see 250 that Tenterden has been the focus of relatively small scale organic growth, which has been usually more of a village type scale than the scale of allocations at Ashford, again, drawing on that different scale of development. And then there's reference to the DPD and the hangover, as it were, of Tent 1. So we see from that paragraph the context for the distribution policy here and how it affects scale in Tenterden. Then there's reference, isn't there, to the high quality of Tenterden's landscape setting, as well as other factors which indicate that development should be limited, phased, and very carefully planned. Therefore, no more major new development is planned in Tenterden itself, apart from Tent 1 and Tilden Gill Road. Combined, these can fulfil the town's development needs over the planned period without adversely affecting the character of the town. And there seems to be there a recognition that Tent 1 is already, as it were, committed, and a reference also to, a recognition also to any further development having an adverse effect.
I think that's what's said there. And obviously that is correct in terms of allocations within the local plan. There are no proposed further major allocations within the local plan suggested. And that's absolutely correct. However, we do have to recognise that major development has been allowed in Tenterden, notwithstanding this comment. And so you will have the reference to the appeal, and we've been to it, the Oaken Gates appeal, which was 50 odd units, which was granted in 2021. And that clearly is major development granted in Tenterden. And then there's still a question as to the deliverability of Tent 1B. Now, I know I certainly do not want to go anywhere near the Housing Land Supply Round Table and discuss that, but this assumes that the needs will be met through that, and clearly we have said they won't.
Thank you. Could you look to CD 2?
Sorry, can I just interrupt? I'm having some communication now about problems with people getting availability on the internet of this.
Sir, I think you're muted. Sir.
Sorry?
No, he's not muted, at least for me, Mr. Ross.
Ah.
Sorry.
Because I've had two problems. One, Miss Reed couldn't actually. Oh, is Mr. Ross? No, Mr. Ross is. Can you hear me, Mr. Ross? Yes, all right. So I've had a communication saying Miss Reed was experiencing communication power issues. So she might want to follow up just at the end if she can get in touch. But I've also had a communication. I mean, it might be the weather, but I've also had communication here that the number of attendees have been lost from the inquiry session, and these include both the council and the appellants represent, well, Carissa and Judith, and all third parties from Tenterden have all lost communication from this, which I'm not sure whether that's very helpful to the whole session, really.
There's well, I agree, it's not very helpful.
So I think, I mean, I know it's quite early in the session, but I think I'm going to have to adjourn and see whether we can do something about it. But I'll just see what Mrs. Williams has to say. Have you got anything to say, Mrs. Williams?
Yes, sir. We're still streaming live, but we have lost those people who were on the session earlier. Miss Reed has sent a communication to say she was experiencing issues with her power, and Miss Judith. So it looks like that end of Kent has lost power.
Well, can I say, sir, I mean, we can continue because frankly, people, the YouTube is still working and people can follow YouTube on their mobile phone, which is not dependent on power.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'd prefer to continue. So if communications can be given out, I don't know how, but to let those people know that it's still on YouTube, that might be the best option, Ms. Williams. Is that?
Yeah. So I'll ask the digital officer here to put a note on the front of the website in the red banner.
But if Ms. Reid hasn't been able to attend the session, which in which those questions were asked, she might be able to. I mean, I don't know. I mean, to be fair, they have been asked, but she certainly can come back and see what she thinks. She might be able to come back on those, and I'll just see where we stand on that. That is assuming she can get back in touch. But anyway, what I'll do then, I'll ask Mr. Howell Williams how much longer he's got for questioning. So, Mr. Howell Williams, have you got an indication? Sorry, if you can unmute. Yes, thank you.
I suspect that no less than half an hour, possibly 45 minutes.
Yeah, because I think we'll still go into the afternoon anyway. Because I would imagine Mr. White will have some re-examination questions, but I'm just wondering whether it'd be worth just adjourning now anyway, and then is that an appropriate time to adjourn, or are you?
I think probably so. I mean, I don't have any re-examination at the moment, but I do think probably to get the message through, to avoid any prejudice, I think probably we should allow the message to be circulated that everyone can continue watching on YouTube. I mean, it would be unfortunate if we completed the session at, say, 1:15 and then people, were unhappy that they hadn't been able to watch it, frankly. I mean, every ounce of me would like to continue and see if we could finish before lunch. But I think, frankly, we do run the risk of certain people who've lost power. It's not exactly a relaxing situation if your power goes down, and I think it's probably sensible to try and get the message out over the mobile phone to people that we will recommence at 1:30 and they can watch it on YouTube on their phones.
Well, that's what I thought. I think we're not going to finish it all before lunch, so we might as well have an adjournment for lunch and then resume. Is that? I mean, I know it's a sort of. I don't know whether it's you're in full flow. I think, Mr. Howell Williams. So, unfortunately, if you can pick it up after lunch, is that okay with you?
Yes, of course it is, and I think Mr. White and you, sir, are right to adjourn now for the reasons given.
Right. So I'll adjourn for an hour for lunch. So we'll resume at 1:30. So the inquiries, and hopefully we have better luck with keeping people on board. But at least they'll have the YouTube, which hopefully should be enough to let them have access. Anyway,